In our last lecture, we discussed Churchill as a wartime leader. His was an age of titanic figures: Stalin, Hitler, Roosevelt. In terms of comparing these four great figures, Churchill certainly brought to his role as wartime leader an experience that none of them had. He had been a soldier in battle, as in fact Hitler had been, but Churchill had led troops at a high level as Lieutenant Colonel of the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers. But he had also had command at the cabinet level during the First World War. First Lord of the Admiralty, none of these leaders could match that. Stalin himself had had almost no military career, playing a little bit of a role during the Russian Civil War. Hitler certainly never having commanded at that kind of level until he became chancellor, and Roosevelt was not a military man. He had had a fairly minor office during the First World War and under Secretary of the Navy. Churchill also brought an historical knowledge that none of them had. Stalin was in no sense of the word a scholar, neither was Hitler. Roosevelt read some history for pleasure, but Churchill was a serious historian who had written about the lessons of history. His study of John, the Duke of Marlborough, his great ancestor, was a study in how to lead a grand alliance. Churchill also had a sense of foresight that none of these other leaders had. Foresight. It is the chief quality of a statesman. It is the most important part of a statesman having a vision. Remember in our first lecture, we defined a statesman as one who has a bedrock of principles, moral compass, a vision, and the ability to build a consensus to achieve that vision. Well, foresight is critical to having a vision. It is the ability to look into the future, to recognize problems, and to come up with solutions that are good for both the short and the long term. And what so troubled Churchill at the end of the First World War, and increasingly in 1943 and 1944, was the grave worry that the same follies would be repeated. How the Western powers at the end of the First World War threw away all of their advantages and plunged the world into another such carnage. Surely we must learn from the past, though Churchill was dubious of this. From the cradle to the grave, man is unteachable, he said. He said that early in his life and late in his life. But he sought to teach, and he sought to teach Roosevelt about the danger represented by the Soviet Union and by Stalin. History, Churchill wrote, can be an impediment as well as an aid to action in the present. And he openly admitted that he had been highly skeptical of the Normandy invasion. He had tried to put it off as long as he could because I had before me the vision of those great frontal assaults of World War I and the enormous loss of manpower. North Africa, Sicily, these were nothing compared to the invasion of France, with the massive fortifications that had been laid down by the Germans, particularly under Rommel. But the invasion was planned and was ready to go. And as you'll recall, the weather was extremely bad. And Eisenhower had to make the choice whether to send his men over and risk an utter rout as a result of the weather, or to hold off and let the Germans get ever more prepared. Let them perhaps discover that the assault was going to come in Normandy and not at Calais. Churchill was with Eisenhower as that decision was being made, and when it was done, having inspected American troops, having shaken the hand of paratroopers who would die that next day in France, Churchill said to Eisenhower, "General, I am with you in this until the end." And Eisenhower would later say, "I knew he meant it." He was a leader who took responsibility and would not leave me hanging out there. Years later, Eisenhower would give an interview about Churchill as a military man with Alistair Cooke, the famous British, then an American journalist. And Eisenhower said he had a very keen strategic sense. Don't let anybody tell you he was an amateur. And the interviewer said, well, didn't he do very badly in school? And Eisenhower said, well, if you ever study my record at West Point, it wasn't very good either. But Churchill did well at Sandhurst, Eisenhower pointed out. And when I went to the Staff College, a far more rigorous place than West Point, I passed out first. People mature differently. And the man I knew was a strategic mastermind. And he played a very important role in developing strategy. So this from a very good source. And so the war would be won. Churchill would follow the American paratroopers, stand and salute their graves in Luxembourg and Belgium. He would stop and, just like General Patton, piss in the Rhine. Well, the Germans had brought this all on. It had been so unnecessary. And then, as the war was winding down at Yalta in 1945, he understood clearly that he was the junior partner in the coalition. And decisions were discussed by Stalin and Roosevelt as though he were almost not present at times. Typical was the fact that later on, in a different context, although the atomic bomb had been developed with the aid of British scientists and sharing all the information had been a critical part of the agreement, the Americans really decided to drop the atomic bomb without consulting the British. They told them they were going to do it, but without really consulting and getting their advice. And it was at Yalta that Churchill tried to make Roosevelt understand the danger represented by the Soviet Union, that the goal of Stalin was absolute mastery over Eastern Europe. One could not deny the merit of the Soviet army. They had fought bravely. No one wanted to take that away from them. But should we turn Poland over to Russia, its age-old enemy, had the war not begun to protect the Poles? There was a Polish government in exile in London, and Churchill fought for them to be given a role in post-war Poland. And Stalin was absolutely clear, no, I will put the government in place, and it will be a communist government. And Roosevelt and the Americans were unwilling to challenge this in the only way it could be challenged ultimately, from a position of absolute strength. And so Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, ultimately Czechoslovakia, would all fall into the grip of an odious tyranny. A tyranny that was responsible for more deaths than had ever been inflicted by the Nazis. Churchill had the foresight, but Britain no longer had the power to enforce it. The next great conference was called in Potsdam, July of 1945. And by this time, Franklin Roosevelt, the champion of freedom, as Churchill called him, the best friend Britain ever had died. And Harry Truman, a very modest figure in the minds of most, had become president. Churchill liked him the first time he met. He thought Truman might have a stronger sense of what the Soviets were up to than Roosevelt had. And they were there together at Potsdam when the general election was held in Britain. The results became known. In May of 1940, the Labor Party, in May of 1945, the Labor Party held its annual convention. There had been a moratorium on a general election during the war. But now Labor said, May of 1945, we want to go back to party politics. We want an election. And Churchill said, then we shall have one. Churchill's whole life was devoted to parliamentary democracy. He said, behind all the high-flown words, democracy is about a little man going into a little booth with a little piece of paper, making an X upon it, and putting it into a little box. Let us hold our election. And Churchill began to campaign in late May of 1945. The war with Japan was still raging. He had, during the time of the war, probably 75 to 80% of the British people behind him. When Victory in Europe Day was announced on May 8th and May 9th, the crowds cheered him when he spoke to them and said, "The evildoers lie prostrate before us." The crowd literally gasped. "Advance, Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom," he had said. And they cheered him. And he felt confident that he would win the election. But we must recall, in Britain's parliamentary democracy, you do not vote for the Prime Minister. You vote for your member of Parliament, and the party that has the largest number of votes wins. Churchill had not only been Minister of Defense and Prime Minister during the war, he had been head of the Conservative Party. Neville Chamberlain died in the fall of 1940. He had been head up until that point, and then Churchill took over the leadership of the Conservative Party. Mrs. Churchill told him, "Don't do it. It will give a party cast to your decisions. You should stand above party divisions." But Churchill did. He knew from his study of Marlborough what happens to a man who doesn't have a party base. And so he became head of the Conservative Party and campaigned very vigorously, despite all the other concerns of the war with Japan still on his mind. And he ran a campaign of which Mrs. Churchill and his daughter disapproved. He came out very strongly against the Labour Party and against socialism. And he made a speech, and Mrs. Churchill marked out the phrase again and again, and he kept putting it back in. "No Labour government can be established in our country without some form of Gestapo." She kept crossing out "without some form of Gestapo." He kept putting it back in. "It will be a government in which a small party clique, as in the Soviet Union, controls Parliament like a puppet. It will have to have regimentation to put in place its program of nationalizing railroads, nationalizing the steel industry. There will have to be censorship, and all criticism will have to be stopped." Well, that was not really what the Labour Party was about. But Churchill believed that socialism was the antithesis of democracy. Remember? Liberalism was about helping the poor. Socialism, he had said from his early days, was about breaking the rich. But once again, he did not have antennae. The British electorate wanted a change. They had fought through this war. They had been told in the middle of the war that there was a blueprint for a new England, for a new Britain. A blueprint for education, a blueprint for health insurance on a broad scale, a blueprint for a welfare state from cradle to grave. And that is what the British people wanted. They did not want to return to the Britain before the war. The class system had become odious to them. And for many, despite their admiration for his leadership, Churchill represented that class distinction. His was the idea in their mind of noblesse oblige. Let us give to the poor, but they don't really deserve it. He didn't think that at all. Milk for babies is the best investment any government ever makes. That's what he said. That's what he believed. But these long-standing hostilities that Labour had for him, going back to the Welsh miners 35 years before, going back to the general strike, there were also many soldiers who just wanted to come home. And they thought that Churchill, the warmonger, might find some other thing for them to fight. And you would find on bathroom walls, as one of his ministers did, going in with General Montgomery, there was a scrawled on the wall, "Winston Churchill is a bastard." And the minister said, "Well, that's foul, most foul." And Montgomery said, "You've got to understand, the men hate politicians." It was also noted that in victory parades, generals got louder cheers from the troops than Churchill did. And as the polling drew near, some generals tried to explain to Churchill, including Lord Mountbatten, his longtime friend, he needed to be cautious. The mood of the ordinary soldier was not in favor of the Conservative Party. And you've also got to understand, the Conservative Party had gotten Britain into this mess, had they not? All through the 30s, they had been in control from 1935 onward. They should be highly discredited. This was the party of Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, Lord Halifax. And so all of these factors came together. Polling was held on July the 5th, 1945. 3 weeks would be taken so that all the absentee ballots of the soldiers could be counted. They seem to have done a better job counting the absentee ballots of their soldiers then than with all our technology we have done in the last election. And the votes came in, and Churchill was in Potsdam. He came back to London for the votes for the final tally, and almost immediately it became clear that there was a shift. His son lost the election. Randolph lost an election. His son-in-law lost the election. Churchill would be reelected as a member of Parliament from his district of Epping. But the rest was a Labor landslide. And the Conservative Party was turned out. And Churchill went immediately to the king and turned in his seals of office. At the height of our victory, he would later write, I was turned out of office. The king suggested that he would make Winston a member of the Order of the Garter. And Churchill said, Your Majesty, it would be inappropriate for me to accept the Order of the Garter from you when I have just gotten the Order of the Boot from the British electorate. It was a crushing blow to him. As bad as the Dardanelles. And yet in the case of the Dardanelles, when he stepped back from it in 1915, he said mistakes were made. I could see why I was blamed. I shouldn't have gotten all the blame, but I could see why. But what had he done wrong now? He had led his people to this great victory. He had worked in concert with labor. He had worked with labor to develop a blueprint for the future. There was much in the labor plan of which he approved and would have put in place. But he was out of office. He was out of office. He went almost immediately to the continent and began to paint. Painting again these bright, magnificent visions of a landscape. Traveling with members of his family and an entourage. 100 suitcases and trunks would go along with him. He lived well. President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower in those days, put at his disposal a villa on the Riviera. He stayed with other friends upon the Riviera. But he brooded upon the world situation. He brooded upon the atomic bomb and what it meant. For now was not only a new tyranny falling over Europe, but this time mankind had in its hands the opportunity utterly to destroy itself. This time we can bring the world to an end. In this frame of mind, he came to the United States in March of 1946. He was accompanied by President Truman out to Fulton, Missouri, to Little Westminster College, where he was to be given an honorary degree, and made a speech. President Truman read the speech ahead of time and approved of it. And to his audience, Churchill said how honored he was to be given this award, how honored he was that the president had come to introduce him at such an event. And then he spoke about the struggle that had been waged and how it was still not over. War and tyranny, he told this audience at Fulton, Missouri, these remain the great enemies of mankind. Have we not seen that this last war nearly brought about the destruction of every aspect of civilization? Do we not understand what war means to the ordinary person? The suffering of men, women, and children as a result of war. Can you not grasp its horror? This from the old soldier, this from the warmonger. And tyranny. Did we fight such a war, undergo such suffering, that now in large parts of the world, men, women, and children still live in fear? in fear and in want, hungry, scared, unable to change their form of government. There is an iron curtain falling across Europe, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in Italy, and behind it many of the most famous capitals of Europe: Bucharest, Sofia, Warsaw. I take nothing away from the bravery of the Russian people in the war. I take nothing away from my wartime colleague, Marshal Stalin. But we cannot allow this new tyranny to destroy those foundations of freedom that we fought to build. Now, Iron Curtain is just one phrase in it. Probably 1/8 of the speech is taken up with how we must resist this new tyranny. Equally, that much is given over to praising the Soviet Union for what it has done in the war. But the papers leapt upon it. Here is that warmonger again. And the American papers took the lead. Churchill has insulted the brave Soviet people. He has caused a crisis where there is not one. He is an alarmist. The Soviets have no desire whatsoever to install their forms of government in Eastern Europe. And President Truman, and people like to say Truman was a gutsy person, and I guess he was. But as soon as this outcry came, Truman said, I had nothing to do with the speech. I never saw it. I wouldn't have approved of a speech like that. So there again was Churchill alone. He had a second vision in these years. And the next year, he went to the University of Zurich to receive an honorary degree. When he was at the University of Miami in Florida, he was receiving an honorary degree, and he looked out over his glasses and said, "It always astounds me that for one who failed so many examinations, I have received so many degrees." But here he was at the University of Zurich getting another degree, and he said, "I am going to say something today that surprises you. I believe that the only course for us is a United States of Europe. And that at the heart of that United States of Europe must be the coming together of France and Germany. The spirit of France and the spirit of Germany, they must be united. And in that United States of Europe, all the talent and ability, the capacity of these great parent races will work together for harmony and good and peace." Now ponder that. A United States of Europe. An idea shocking to many there in his audience. And yet it was the vision of the future. It would take more than 50 years to work out. But that is foresight. And already at Fulton, Missouri, he had said to the Americans, "I ask of you not an alliance with Britain. I ask for something far deeper and richer. And that is for a fraternal alliance. We are not bound by contracts. We are like two brothers with the same ideals." And he had this vision of Britain and the United States working together. A United States of Europe, Britain contributing to it, but tied in the closest way to our own country. That was his vision of the future. It is interesting today that we have the United States of Europe. They have chosen a different, I think, less satisfactory name. But the United States of Europe. And then, at the time of the tremendous tragedy, on September the 11th, there was Tony Blair, being called by President Bush the best friend America has, Britain. That vision is still there, still the foundation. And this from a man who first entered Parliament when Victoria was Queen of the British Empire and Empress of India. The Labour government did not turn out to be all the British people had hoped for, and by 1951 they were ready for another change. And the Conservative Party came back, and with it, Winston Churchill, taking over as Prime Minister in the fall of 1951. Now, he is already 77 years of age. I mean, when he was leading Britain through World War II, we would have had him retired, wouldn't we? And now, in the latter part of his 70s, he is Prime Minister one more time. And during this period, he continues to work for the closest possible relations with America, making visit after visit to Washington, where his old friend Dwight Eisenhower is now president. But he understood that while Britain and America have the same ideals, they do not always have the same interest. Eisenhower and those around him did not share this vision of a fraternal alliance. In fact, for Eisenhower and much of the American administration, the most important thing about Britain was to get rid of its colonial empire. Churchill had said, "I did not become First Minister of the King in order to watch over the dismantling of the British Empire." But he also went on and added, "Someone else will have to do it. I will not." And that empire was indeed coming to its end. India received its independence while Churchill was out of office. He had long spoken against the independence of India. He doubted that it was ready for democracy. It was a land that kept millions of its citizens in the status of being untouchables. He feared what came about: bloodshed on a large scale, hundreds of thousands of lives lost between Hindus and Muslims, and ultimately the separation of that country into Pakistan and India. But when it was voted, he was still out of office, the independence of India became a reality. He called to him leading Indian statesmen just for a private meeting, and he said, "Now that it is a reality, I will do everything that I can. I only hope this, that out of independence will come a better life for the ordinary Indian." Churchill had known that the position of Britain in the world rested upon that great empire. And in the 50s, it was indeed being dismantled in Africa, in the Pacific. But he had a new vision as well. If Britain no longer ruled this great empire, it could still be a moral force. And for Churchill, that is what the British Empire had always been about, a moral force. In the 1920s, when a British general had shot down Indians, Churchill spoke out in the most bitter terms against him and said, "If we ever substitute for our moral authority sheer force, then everything the British Empire stands for will be as dust." And he wanted Britain to use its moral authority for détente. Yes, this old warmonger and alarmist believed that the atomic bomb had put us in such a situation that there had to be détente between the Soviet Union and the United States. And when Stalin died, 1953, that was the chance. A new government is in power. And he worked again and again on visits to Washington to convince Eisenhower to meet with the new Soviet leadership and start a policy of détente. Stop the tensions and work together. It is just like during the Second World War. They are there, and our first priority must be never to have a terrible war. But he wasn't listened to. The meeting never came about. The summit he wanted never came about. And Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "Winston was here again, as charming and witty as ever. He wants us to go back to a time during the war when Britain and America were almost as one. That will never be. And those of us who were part of that time No, it was never that way even then. We have the same ideals, but our interests are different. On April the 5th, 1955, he stepped down as Prime Minister. The last night he dined with the young Queen. He had accepted her wish that he finally become a Knight of the Garter. And he was now Sir Winston Churchill as he led her to the door. Brilliant, vivacious, he said, I began my parliamentary career under Victoria, and it is a special glory to me to be able to say once again, God save the Queen. And his last word to his cabinet, stay close to the Americans.